Operation Perun. Last order. February 1945. It was freezing hard, even for the Urals. Dark, heavy-hanging clouds covered the sky, hiding the sun, turning the day into a gray, lifeless haze. It seemed that nature itself was frozen in anticipation of something inevitable, and the occasional gust of icy wind brought with it a feeling of anxiety. Captain Arkady Gromov came out of the NKVD headquarters in Sverdlovsk, clutching a leather folder with orders in his hand. He stood in the shade, lighting a cigarette, looking at the snow-covered square in front of the headquarters. Soldiers scurried around, trucks left deep ruts in the snow, and officers wrapped in greatcoats hurried about their business. Gromov had seen a lot, too much over the years. First the purges, then the war, the dirt of the trenches, the deaths of comrades. But even now, on the eve of victory, he felt that something much darker was ahead. He was called unexpectedly. The order was given directly from Moscow. The squad was urgently heading to a remote Ural mine where a group of undercover geologists disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The last message from them came 3 days ago. "We have found the object. Let's explore. Damn, he's moving. God, no." Then only noise and a shrill, inhuman scream. Gromov turned up his collar and slowly moved towards the barracks, where the squad was waiting for him. Inside, in a dimly lit room with peeling walls, 4 people were sitting at a table. Senior Lieutenant Olga Belovais, thin, with sharp features and a cold, tenacious gaze. A historian and expert on ancient cultures, she worked with archives in Lubyanka. She was one of the few people who knew about the secret operations of the NKVD related to the search for anomalous objects. Lieutenant Viktor Malinin is a scout, a veteran of the front, a master of covert operations. His face is covered with thin scars, his hair is cropped short, and his expression is stony, as if carved from granite. He didn't say much, but his presence was always felt like a tense spring, ready to release at any moment. Sergeant Alexei Rogachev is tall, broad-shouldered, with the look of a man who has had to kill. The sniper, a good marksman, went through the Kursk Bulge, took Berlin, but never liked to talk about the war. Unlike others, he did not believe in unknown threats, only in bullets, knives, and strong fists. And finally, Major Pavel Sorokin, a liaison from the NKVD, an observer, a man whose gaze sent goosebumps. There was something strange about his behavior. He knew more than he was saying. No one knew how long he had worked in law enforcement, but there was always a feeling around him that he was involved in cases that it was better not to ask. Gromov glanced briefly at each of them, sat down, and put the folder on the table. "Object 12, he said softly, opening the papers. "The so-called stone disk. Found in an old mine. The geologists are gone. Your task is to find the missing, examine the object, and report to the center. If the object poses a threat, destroy it. Any questions?" Everyone was silent. Only Belova frowned, looking at the photographs. They showed a massive stone circle covered with ancient writings. In one of the pictures there are silhouettes of people, distorted, as if not quite human. "Is something wrong?" Gromov asked. Belova hesitated, then nodded. "These symbols, they are very old, not Slavic. They are closer to the pagan signs of the ancient Ural tribes, but there is something different here. I've seen them in old archives, in places where they found the bodies of people who had changed." Malinin snorted. "Changed?" "They were found burned, with a strange grin. Or they didn't find it at all." Gromov flicked the lighter, staring thoughtfully at the flame. "Then it'll be fun. Get ready. We leave tomorrow at dawn." Major Sorokin leaned back in his chair and grinned. "Don't be afraid, Gromov. Comrade Stalin himself will go with us if necessary." But there was a strange shadow in his eyes. The next morning, the squad flew to Li 2. The plane trembled as it made its way through the thick clouds. The taiga stretched beneath them, endless, snowy, and dead. Gromov was sitting at the porthole, smoking, looking down. A strange feeling was growing inside him, as if something other than a simple operation was ahead. A few hours before departure, he received a personal report from the center, a piece of paper written in a clear, emotionless handwriting. The mine was closed in 1937 after events that cannot be disclosed. The archives state, "The subject is not subject to awakening. If contact with the object is established, the squad is ordered to eliminate themselves by any means necessary. Your faith in the victory of socialism should be above fear. The center is counting on you." Gromov clenched his fists. Something was rising from the past, and that something shouldn't have woken up. In the evening, the plane landed at a small airfield. They were met by a local NKVD operative, a silent man in a gray coat. "Cars," was all he said. The column of ZES moved along the frozen road towards the mine. There was silence in the cabin. Gromov noticed that even Rogachev, usually relaxed, was nervously checking his weapon. Belova was trembling, looking out the window. "Damn," she suddenly gasped. Gromov looked the same way. In the distance, among the trees, a man flashed by. He stood in the snow, motionless, like a statue. They drove past, but his eyes were glowing in the dark. Malinin exhaled slowly. "That's where we're going, isn't it?" "Yes." And ahead, beyond the forests and the snow, the gates to the abyss awaited them. The road to the mine stretched through endless snowy forests, the branches of century-old pine trees hanging over a narrow strip of ice, like the claws of an invisible beast. The ZS moved slowly, their metal hulls creaking, and in this suffocating silence, even the sound of running engines seemed muffled, as if nature itself was trying to drown out the presence of people. The driver was staring intently ahead, not being distracted for a second, and an NKVD officer in a gray coat was sitting next to him, silently clutching a worn document in his hands. The cabin smelled of tobacco, winter uniforms, and a subtle anxiety that permeated everyone without exception. Gromov sat on the edge, watching the road. A cigarette was smoldering in his hand, but he didn't even take a puff. His thoughts were preoccupied with what lay ahead. He knew that this operation was not an ordinary one. He felt it even the moment he read the last lines of the order. If the center ordered itself to be destroyed, then there was something in the depths of this abandoned mine that went beyond the usual logic. Belova was sitting next to him, thoughtfully looking out the window. Her eyes slid over the dark silhouettes of the trees, and the further they drove into the taiga, the heavier her breathing became. Gromov noticed how she clenched her fingers, as if trying to warm herself, but not from the cold, from the feeling that everyone was watching. "Do you know something that they didn't tell us at headquarters?" "What is it?" he asked quietly, without turning around. Belova flinched, but did not immediately respond. "These symbols, I've seen them in old recordings, in the archives which are kept under the heading of special importance. They appeared in places where mass disappearances took place, in Siberia, in Karelia, even in Mongolia. And every time they appeared, people either disappeared without a trace or returned, not quite human." Gromov frowned. "Were these the same runes?" She nodded. "Similar, but this disc, it's more ancient. And he shouldn't have been found." Malinin, who was sitting opposite, leaned back, grinning. "Fairy tales," he said. "I don't believe in devilry." Rogachev, who had been silent up to this point, suddenly chuckled. "Do you know how quickly a person disappears in the taiga?" "What is it?" he asked, looking at Malinin. "One step to the side and that's it. Even if you're shouting, even if you're standing 3 meters away from the road, the forest is swallowing you up. Malinin wanted to say something, but at that moment the car stopped abruptly. The driver swore through his teeth, reached for the dashboard, but the engine, choking, froze. "What the hell?" he muttered. The NKVD officer in the gray coat slowly raised his head and, without saying a word, went outside. Gromov followed his movement, feeling the tension in the air. The driver tried to start the engine, but it didn't even respond. There was a dull, suffocating silence in the air. And then something moved in the darkness between the trees. Bella shrank back into the seat. Malinin immediately reached for his pistol, and Rogachev froze, glaring at the forest. Gromov saw it too. Figure. A human standing motionless in the snow, as if carved out of stone. She didn't move, didn't make a single move, just stared. The officer in the gray coat stepped forward, bowing his head. "Who are you?" "What is it?" he asked loudly. There was no response, and suddenly the figure wavered, unnaturally, like a broken puppet mechanism. She jerked forward. The driver swore. Gromov was already reaching for his weapon, but at that moment the figure just disappeared. She disappeared into the trees as if she had never been there. Rogachev exhaled loudly. "I don't like this," he said. Gromov looked at the gray officer. He didn't show any emotion, but there was a flicker of fear in his eyes. No, it was recognition. "To the cars," he said softly. The engine started up again, and the convoy continued on its way. Gromov felt like something had changed. It was as if they had crossed an invisible line. They reached the mine only in the evening. A forgotten place opened up before them. Old barracks, dilapidated wooden buildings, rusty wire, bent as if it had survived something terrible. In the center is a mine sinkhole, near which stood an old winch covered with frost. The silence was dead. They got out of the cars, turned up the collars of their greatcoats, and moved forward. The first person they saw was a security guard. He was sitting right on the snowy ground, leaning against the wall of a wooden warehouse. His eyes were open. Gromov took a step closer and suddenly realized that there was no life in this body. "Is he cold?" Malinin asked quietly. Belova came closer and suddenly recoiled. "No," she muttered. "It's not just freezing." Rogachev sat down next to her and took a closer look. The body was dry. It was as if he had been dried from the inside out. "What the hell?" he gasped. But Gromov was already looking towards the mine. He couldn't explain why, but he sensed that something was waiting for them there. Something is looking out of the darkness underground. The silence of the mine weighed down like an invisible weight. The feeling that no one had been here for decades was a lie. People had been here only recently. But there was nothing left of their presence except footprints in the snow, scattered belongings, and this guard sitting against the wall with a dried-up body and glassy eyes in which a mute plea was forever frozen. Gromov bent down, carefully examining his face. The features sharpened, the skin stretched over the skull, as if something had sucked all the moisture out of it. It doesn't look like frostbite. It doesn't look like natural death. He wasn't killed, but he didn't die a natural death either. Belova stood nearby, frowning, and nervously fingered the folds of her greatcoat. This man died in fear, it was obvious. His face was frozen, but there was some kind of death grimace in it, as if at the last second he saw something that the human mind could not accept. Rogachev squatted down and touched his palm. His fingers were brittle, as if they had dried up. He straightened up and glanced at the shaft. Gromov followed him with his eyes. Yes, there is something wrong with this place. Not just an abandoned mine, not just a camp abandoned in a panic. There is something here that looks at them from the darkness. They entered the camp. The tents of the geologists were torn apart. Abandoned documents were lying underfoot. The cold camp kitchen was frozen in the moment. A ladle in a saucepan, mugs with half-poured tea. Things lay as if people had just disappeared right during lunch, without even having time to recoil from the table. Malinin picked up a couple of sheets and scanned them, A list of instruments, measurements, handwritten notes. The object is unstable, nothing during the day, but at night. Then there was a jagged line, as if the person who was writing had jerked violently. Gromov bent down and picked up a piece of tarpaulin torn from the tent. There were scratches on it, deep as if they had been inflicted by claws. But there were no animals here. No wolves, no bears. They avoided these places. Belova stopped in front of one of the tents, bent down and, without touching, looked at the dirty mat on which 3 people were supposed to sleep. She suddenly felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. There was something alien here, some kind of sticky energy that hung in the air. There were people here. They're gone, but not by themselves, she whispered. Rogachev looked around the camp and frowned. Why aren't there any tracks? If they ran out, if something chased them, there should be footprints. But this is just the entrance. They came in here and didn't come out. Gromov clenched his fists, trying to figure out what to do. We need to inspect the mine. They have no choice. He looked up at the sky. Night was coming soon, and if trouble awaits them, it will start at night. The gray officer who accompanied them stood silently to the side. He didn't ask, wasn't interested, as if he already knew what had happened. We're going down to check our weapons, Gromov said shortly. They began to prepare. We checked the assault rifles, equipment, and trigger cables. Belova took an old lantern out of her bag, laying out scrolls with notes in front of her, which described the history of such places. She hardly spoke, too focused, reading old lines that looked more like deathbed confessions. An hour later, they were standing at the entrance to the mine. The darkness inside was absolute. She seemed to be alive. She was breathing. Gromov stepped in first, feeling the cold immediately envelop him. It was much colder here than outside. The icy air, the smell of metal, the smell of something old, ancient. They went deeper inside, illuminating the walls with lanterns. Rocks, wooden beams, and in some places the remaining mining tools. But soon they came across the first corpse. A man in a torn jumpsuit was sitting against the wall, clutching a small icon in his hands. His face. It was mutilated. His mouth was wide open, as if he was screaming before he died. Rogachev sat down and ran his hand across the floor. His bones were broken, but not outwardly. It's like he just curled up. Belova stirred at the walls. They had runes on them, fresh ones. Someone drew them recently, she whispered. But why? And at that moment, the mine began to shake. Laughter was heard. Gromov abruptly raised his head. It was Malinin's voice. But Malinin was standing nearby. And then everyone heard. Help! A voice, barely audible, sounded ahead in the depths of the mine. The voice of the one who disappeared 3 days ago. Gromov cocked his machine gun sharply. At that moment, the lights of the lanterns began to fade. And ahead, in the depths of the mine, something moved. The darkness inside the mine thickened, turning into a dense curtain, absorbing the light of the lanterns. The air became heavy, stale, and filled with a strange smell, a mixture of dampness, rust, and something that could not be described in words. The footsteps sounded muffled, and each of the fighters felt that this tunnel, this mine, should not exist. The voice continued to sound ahead. It was muffled, barely discernible, but it was there. Help! Here! Belova shrank back, as if expecting a blow. Gromov caught her gaze, startled and tense. She no longer believed that the voice belonged to a human. It's a hoax, she whispered. That's not the one who disappeared. Rogachev stepped forward, clutching the machine gun, his fingers white with tension. We have to check, he said. Gromov nodded slowly, realizing that he had no choice. Either go ahead or leave something behind that can come out. They moved on, deeper into the tunnel. The walls here were different smooth, as if someone had carved them with incredible precision. In places, the same symbols appeared that Belova had seen in the recordings. The footsteps echoed strangely, as if the sound was moving differently than it should. And suddenly, they saw him. The lanterns illuminated a figure standing a few meters ahead. Human. Or something that looks like a human. The one who was once a geologist stood straight, unnaturally frozen. His face was hidden under the shadow of his hood. His arms dangled at his sides, and he did not move. "Are you alive?" Gromov asked sharply. Silence. Then a jerk. The creature darted forward but did not approach. It disappeared, leaving behind only the echo of footsteps. Belova exhaled sharply. Malinin cursed. "We're going back," Gromov said. But then something moved behind them. Laughter rang out. Low, deep, coming from the shaft itself. Belova pressed herself against the wall, clutching her temples with her hands. "It's something ancient," she whispered. "It was sealed here." "And now what?" Rogachev asked, pointing the barrel of his machine gun at the darkness. We woke him up. A rumble went through the tunnel, and the lights flickered. And then there was a step. Heavy, thunderous. Someone came out of the darkness towards them. Gromov took a step back, feeling something rising from the depths. Black Perun woke up. The darkness in the mine became absolute, overwhelming. The lanterns flickered helplessly. Their light seemed weak, as if it was being pulled by something invisible. The air became thick, heavy, filled with electrical tension, similar to a pre-thunderstorm state when the hairs on your arms stand on end, and a feeling of imminent impact hovers around. But there was no thunderstorm here. Only footsteps, booming like thunder. Gromov raised his machine gun and stared into the darkness without blinking. Something was coming. It took its time. It knew they wouldn't leave. Belova stood next to him, pale, with her eyes wide open. She didn't speak, but the truth was reflected in her gaze. She understood what they were up against. Rogachev slowly dropped to one knee, taking aim. "Do we see him?" "I'm sorry," he muttered. Gromov did not answer. The darkness stirred. For a moment it seemed like it was just a shadow, but then she stood up, taking shape. A tall figure rising out of the darkness. Human. Or not a person. She was standing straight, arms down, head tilted slightly to the side. His face was hidden under a deep shadow, but two eyes glowed in the darkness, red as hot coals. Gromov fired first. A burst of automatic fire cut through the darkness. The roar shook the shaft, and dust fell from the walls. The bullets hit the figure, but it didn't move. "Damn," Malinin whispered, raising his weapon. The figure took a step. The bullets weren't helping anymore. Laughter rolled through the mine again, loud, low, coming from everywhere. And at that moment, the mine began to shake. A rumble went through the walls, the air compressed, and something ancient, something sealed here for centuries, fully awakened. Belova screamed, clutching her head. "It's not here! Stop it!" she screamed. "It's in us!" Gromov turned around and then saw Sorokin. The major stood motionless. There is emptiness in his eyes. He was smiling. "He chose me," he whispered. "He's talking to me." Gromov raised his machine gun. "Are you crazy?" Sorokin laughed. "Crazy? Oh no, I can finally see. We are dust. We are only vessels for something greater." The darkness began to move around him. He wasn't moving. The mine was moving with him. Belova was crying. "We have to stop him," she whispered. "He becomes his guide." Rogachev took aim. "If we don't kill him, he'll open a passage." Sorokin turned to them, his eyes burning with a crimson light. "You can't kill me." Gromov fired. The bullet went straight into his chest. Sorokin did not fall. He just smiled wider. And then the mine opened up. There was a crash. The stone walls began to crack, and dust rose in a cloud. Gromov grabbed Belova by the arm and pulled her back. "Run!" They rushed back down the tunnel, dust filling the space, and an inhuman roar could be heard behind them. Gromov heard footsteps. Other people's footsteps. They raced after him, getting closer. He ran outside first, sucking the frosty air into his lungs. Rogachev followed him. Belova got out, panting. Gromov looked around. "Malinin?" The darkness slammed shut. The mine collapsed. Malinin's last cry died away under tons of stone. Everything went quiet. Belova was sobbing, clenching her hands into fists. Rogachev sat down in the snow and stared into the void. Gromov exhaled slowly, looking at the blocked entrance to the mine, and then he heard it. Through the wind, through the dead silence. A quiet, barely audible voice coming from the ground. "We woke him up,"